Hey, how's it going? This is Seth from REtipster.com, and in this video, we're going to talk about an issue that has the potential to make or break a land deal, and that is the Perk Test. So what exactly is a Perk Test? Well, the word perk is actually short for the word percolation. And percolation is what happens when water hits the soil and then drains through the soil. And the reason this is important is because a lot of properties out there do not have access to a nearby sewer system. If you ever want to build a house or a building or a dwelling of any kind on one of these types of properties, if you want to be able to flush the toilet and have the wastewater go to an appropriate place, you need to have a septic system in place. And a septic system is essentially just this giant underground tank where all of this wastewater goes. And in time, a lot of the wastewater will overflow out of the septic system into the soil, and then the soil will clean the water before it gets back into the natural system underground. Septic tanks are actually a brilliant invention, and as important and as gross as septic tanks are, in order for them to work properly, the soil that it's in, it needs to be able to pass a Perk Test, which means that when this wastewater goes into the soil, it needs to be able to drain properly through that soil. And there's a lot of places around the country where the water simply doesn't drain fast enough, or it doesn't drain at all. This can happen whenever the soil has a lot of clay or silt in it, because that soil is very, very dense, and it takes a long time for water to drain through it. And when you've got a septic tank in place and that wastewater isn't draining properly, that's a massive problem. That means the septic tank basically doesn't work and you can't flush the toilets, which means you can't have a house there. So that's why it's very, very important to understand if you are going to build something there, and if you're not going to use a sewer system, can that soil pass a Perk Test? Now, in most jurisdictions around the country, the way a Perk Test works is you'll have to call the county health department or somebody at the county level, and they will come out on the property and perform this Perk Test for you. Usually the cost is anywhere from $150 to $1,500, somewhere in that range. And the cost usually depends on what the county feels like charging, and also how many people are involved in this test. Sometimes the person from the county will simply go out to the property and just dig a hole and pour water into it and time how fast it drains. Other times you'll have to get contractors out there with their heavy equipment to dig a much, much larger hole and do it that way. So it kind of depends on what's involved in the process. But essentially all that's happening here is they're digging a hole in the ground, they're pouring water in it, and then timing how long it takes for that water to drain through the soil. And if it doesn't drain fast enough, or if it doesn't drain at all, then it's going to fail its Perk Test, which can be a huge problem and have a major, major impact on the value of the property. As you can imagine, if the highest and best use of a property is to simply build a house, and all of a sudden you can't build a house anymore, then that kind of does a bad thing to the value of that land. So how important is a Perk Test to your specific situation? Well, I think you got to ask yourself a few questions. First of all, how much are you paying for the property? I know a lot of the vacant lots that I've bought, I've been paying, well under $1,000 to buy the property free and clear, which is very, very cheap. And in cases like that, you kind of have to weigh the benefit of paying more for a Perk Test than for the price of the property outright. And especially if speed is an issue, if you have to get that deal closed like this week, then honestly, it may be worth rolling the dice and taking a risk, not necessarily knowing if the property is going to pass that Perk Test. I'm not necessarily telling you that you need to do that, but I'm telling you, in my experience, when I have come up against this situation, that's how I've handled it. And to date, I've never gotten burned by it. I can't tell you that's never going to happen, because it could, but I've never had this come back to bite me. So just take that for what it's worth. I think you also have to ask yourself, are there any alternative uses for this property if I can't build a dwelling on this land? For example, there's a lot of properties that may fail a Perk Test, but that's not necessarily the end of the world. You could also use this property for farming, or simply using it for outdoor storage, or using it for camping or hunting, or any number of things that does not require having a house or a building on the property. So it still has value. It may be much less value, but it doesn't necessarily mean the property is worthless just because it happened to fail its Perk Test. So that's another thing to keep in mind. If you're working on a deal and you're in a hurry and you're not paying a lot of money for it, and you're willing to take some risk with this Perk Test situation, one thing that you can look at, just to give yourself some vague idea of what's going on, is to look at the adjoining parcels of the property and see, are there any houses or buildings built on those parcels? Because if there are, and if they've clearly resolved that issue to the point where they could build something, then there's at least a chance that you'll be able to do that too, just based on the fact that others in the area have been able to do that. And keep in mind, this is very important. Just because neighbors were able to do it does not mean that you will be able to do it. But in the absence of any other information, it is definitely an important thing to consider. Another thing you'll want to keep in mind is that if you've got a property that's large in size, it's entirely possible that the property could fail the Perk Test in one area, but pass the Perk Test in another area. I once had a 12-acre parcel of land that actually failed the Perk Test in several spots around the property, but they were able to find one section of it in the corner that did pass the Perk Test. So if you happen to test one spot and find that it does not perk, it's not necessarily the end of the world. You'll want to make sure you're testing other areas just to make sure you've exhausted all your other options and that you truly are sure that the property really does fail that test, because in a lot of cases the soil can differ based on where you're at on the property. So be sure to check that out if you're doing this. Another thing to keep in mind is that it is possible in some areas to build what's called a modified septic system. This kind of thing is not always feasible and it can get very expensive very fast. So in a lot of cases it's like really not worth it. But if you've got a property where the feasibility of a septic system has all the impact in the world on the value of that property, then it could be an avenue worth considering. It's also worth noting that in some cases, if you have time and if you're willing to wait long enough, just because there's not a sewer system available to your property today doesn't mean there won't be one in 10 years or 20 or 30 years. As the population continues to grow in a lot of areas, it's entirely possible that developments could extend out from the city, and at some point in the future there will be a sewer system available, and at that point then you can build a house on the property, but you simply can't do it if you're going to rely on a septic system. This one is definitely a long shot. I would never purchase a property with the assumption that someday there will be a sewer system there. However, if you find yourself with a property that you already own and you're in this situation, you never know. At some point, there could be a sewer system available and you can pursue it at that point. So it's just a little glimmer of hope to keep in mind if you're in that situation. If you want to learn more about all this and see a lot more detailed information, definitely go check out the blog post where I cover all these details and a lot more over at REtipster.com. I'll be sure to link to it beneath this video if you want to check it out. Whatever your situation is, I hope this was helpful. I hope it gives you more confidence and information as you're pursuing the due diligence process on the properties you're looking at. And I wish you all the best in your next land deal. Talk to you later.